we're going to talk about FHIR. The full form of FHIR is Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources. It's a standard by HL7. And today we are going to basically focus on what the structure of data in FHIR looks like. That's the subject of this talk. We will talk more about how do we actually exchange data next time. So we'll dive right in. So FHIR is a healthcare data exchange specification given by HL7. Some of you will be familiar with the older standards such as V2 and then more recently V3 and CDA. FHIR is different from those, and in some ways it has characteristics similar to V2. In other ways, it has characteristics that are similar to V3 and CDA. The other thing about FHIR is that it's a standard that's available freely. Nobody has to create a login or anything to be able to access the specification. Everything is freely available for everyone to view on this website. So we're going to click on it and go there. So this is what it looks like, the home page. Right now we are in release 4. And you can see that it lists out some basic stuff. It has, it tells you about the various introductions. It talks about the various resources. We'll be talking about what resources are in a bit. So everything basically is here. You can basically navigate through the whole specification from this page. One of the interesting things here is you'll see there's a link to roadmap and timelines. And this is because FHIR is still a developing standard. Some parts of FHIR have been made normative, which means that there will be no further breaking changes to those parts of the specification. But there's a lot of stuff in FHIR that's still under trial use. So that's just an important point to keep in mind, that not everything that you will see here on this website is not going to change. It's very much possible that a lot of it will change or can change. There is some stuff that has been made normative, and that stuff is not going to change. However, they can add stuff to it. They'll just not make any breaking changes to it so that any code you have written today will break tomorrow. That's not going to happen for the normative parts of the specification. So that's where you can get everything. You can access the whole specification. You just go to that link. The only thing you have to keep in mind is that if you're using any of the FHIR stuff for, especially their logo, like I'm showing here, and you're using it for commercial purposes, you have to make sure that you do acknowledge that it's a HL7 trademark. Other than that, everything there is free. Now, FHIR has, as I said, it's a data exchange standard, and some of you might be familiar with the older ones. So it's in some ways it's similar to those. Those also had certain components to them. By components, I mean what those standards were about. And we have, again, FHIR, we have 4 basic components. There's the information model, which describes what your data looks like and also what it carries. So that's your information model. One interesting thing that FHIR specifies, which was not there for V2 or for V3 actually too, to some extent, was how do you exchange the data? The exchange mechanisms are also a part of the standard in FHIR, which was not a part of the standard for V2, for example. You could do a TCP/IP, you could do an FTP, you could do whatever. It only described the data content and format and the conformity. So again, conformity, just like we had for V2 and for V3 and CDA, we have conformance rules. We have how you validate, how you apply constraints to the model. So all that is a part of the standard. And then there's also a component of terminology where you basically describe where basically the specification describes how you can change your codes, right? The codes for your data, for example, the procedure codes for lab procedures and so on. So those are the four important, there's the four components of the full specification. And mostly in our introduction between today and Friday, we are going to focus on the information model and the usage. And these are in some way the core parts of FHIR standard. And they actually make FHIR standard what it is. The information model is about well-structured expressive data models, and exactly what that data structure is, that's what we're going to talk about today. And then the other one is that the data mechanisms, the exchange mechanisms that are used for exchanging this data, they are simple and efficient, and FHIR uses the RESTful API to exchange data, which is what we will talk about on Friday. So there are a few architectural principles. So why if you wonder why we have these data models and why we have these exchange mechanisms, it's all built around these 6 principles that FHIR architecture tries to focus on. And the ones you'll see on top, reuse, performance, usability, and data fidelity, that they have to do with the structure, the data structure. Scalability has to do more with the exchange mechanism, and then implementability is both. So the data structure that we're going to talk about, as well as the exchange mechanisms that we will talk about, are actually prevalent across the industry. They are not anything specific to FHIR. And FHIR, what FHIR did was they tried to use the most up-to-date technology at the time when the standard was set up for the data structure as well as for the exchange. So today's focus is information model, right? So as I already mentioned, the data is exchanged in common industry standards. And there are 3 standards that you can exchange FHIR data in. So unlike HL7, which had to be formatted in a very specific manner, in FHIR, you have some flexibility as to how you exchange the data. You can use JSON, XML, or you can use Turtle RDF. Now, most of the times, if you look at the various servers that are available, they are doing exchange in JSON format. So that's the one that we are going to focus on. But there, keep in mind that it's possible to do a FHIR, construct a FHIR data structure in XML format as well, or in Turtle RDF. So with that, since we're going to focus on JSON, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the JSON data formats. We'll go very briefly, maybe the next 5 to 10 minutes to talk about JSON. I have sent out a video link. I don't know if people got an opportunity to look at it, but it's very important that you understand the JSON format, because even the example that you're going to look at today, you need to be able to read through it and see what's going on. So all the data in JSON format, in FHIR, at least the FHIR data, all the FHIR data is going to be exchanged in terms of resources, and what resources are nothing but JSON objects. So right, think of in terms of all FHIR data is being exchanged as JSON objects. And what a JSON object looks like is shown right here. You have those curly brackets, and then you have a key and a value. So there are key value pairs here, right? So there's a name, and then that key name has a value of 1, 2, 3, 4. And if you were to represent this data structure in a graphical format, this is how you would represent it. So you start with, so this is a JSON object. You start with that curly bracket, then you can have a white space, and then you have a string, right? So you have a string here, a string, and then that string, and then you have a colon, and then you have a value, and that's what you're seeing here. You have a string, a colon, and then a value. And then you can actually, if you follow this, you can actually go back and repeat this. So you can do a comma, and you can repeat this whole thing. Or you can decide to exit, right? So if you're done with this list, you can just exit, and then you end it with a curly bracket. So this is how you represent a JSON object. So essentially, it's nothing but a set of key value pairs, right? And if you're familiar with XML, it's similar to that. In XML, you have tags, and then within tags you have values. Here, the tags are the keys, and then the value is the value. So the value here actually can be multiple things. So this is just showing what possible values you have. You can have a number, you can have, we saw string already, we saw number in the previous example. You can also have the object, the whole object that we saw in the last slide, that itself can be a value too. And then you have an array. So an array is a list, right? It's a list of values. So any of these elements in an array can again be a value, and that value can again be a string, a number, an object, an array, whatever, right? So this is the structure for an array, right? You start with a square bracket. You have a value, and then you have a comma, and then you can repeat. And when you're done, you can just exit with a close square bracket. So that's what this is showing here. So you can have either a string, this is an array of strings, you can have an array of Boolean, you can have an array of numbers, numeric values. So those are all here. Okay. So we saw JSON object, we said JSON object has a string, which is a key, and then it has a value, which can be a string, a number, a Boolean, an array, it could be another object. So we are going to see those examples here. So this is just to remind you, this was our object. And here, this value is an array, right? It's an array of numbers. And here, so that's your string, that's your key, and your value now is an object, right? And then you can also have an array of objects. So this is an array. So this is your string, this is your key, this is your value. And in this value, you have an array, and this array is an array of objects. Okay. So as we start looking at some JSON resources, you will see all these complicated structures like this. So I just wanted to make sure that you've seen this, you have an idea of what you're looking at. So you will see an array of objects. It's pretty common to see that. Okay. So let's come back from from JSON. So JSON is again a data exchange format which is independent of FHIR. It's actually native to JavaScript, which is very commonly used nowadays for any web exchanges. But FHIR has nothing to do with JSON. FHIR is just saying you can exchange data in JSON format, just to be clear. So we just did a digression on JSON just to make sure that all of you are familiar with what we are going to look at. So we come back to FHIR now. So we talked about some of the architectural principles, and one of the things we talked about was data fidelity. And we said that, and to ensure data fidelity, FHIR is a typed standard. So you just cannot put any kind of data you like. You have to follow, your data has to be one of the data types that are defined by the FHIR standard. And there are two kinds of data types that FHIR defines. There's a simple or primitive data type, and there's a complex data type. And like everything else, like I mentioned on the first slide, everything is available freely. You can look up the data types. So we are going to go to that website. We are going to go to the web page of data types and take a look at these simple and complex. What I mean by simple data types and what I mean by complex data types. So I'm going to click on this. Okay. So this takes me to the data types page. And here he talks about the possible data types, and he gives you more meta and special purpose. We are skipping those because those are more detailed and more specific, specialized cases. So we're not going to look at that. For most of what we are going to do, for all of what we are going to do, we just need simple and complex. So, and you can see they have shown these pictures. These are UML diagrams, and these relationships they have shown are basically inheritance relationships. So it's saying, for example, a data type, the datetime data type is inheriting from an element, right? So this is like the base, right? So this is your base data type, and then you have all these other data types are basically inherit from them. They are all descendants. So here's an example. So I'll just take one example here, simple one, right? String. So let me see if it takes me to. So here's a string, right? So it gives you the details about string, and it even tells you what the regex looks like. And there's no point in us going through this. We are not right now doing any programming. But basically, it tells you if you had to validate whether your data you're getting is a string or not, you can use this regex to validate it, right? And then it gives you the description, how many characters you can have in it, and so on. So the idea here is to show you people that everything that you need to know about the standard you can find here, right? I mean, most of you are familiar with integers, strings, boolean, decimals. So I don't really have to, the purpose is not to go over each of them individually, but everything is available here. So if anytime you're confused or you're stuck and you want to make sure, you just want to check what is valid, what I can put in there or what I cannot put in there, you just have to come here and look this up. So let's talk about complex data types, because I think they are a little bit more, they require a little bit more discussion than this. So here's one example I'm going to take. Let's see. Let's take coding. Okay. So here's what a complex data type is. Okay, so we are going to look at the JSON structure of it. Okay, so I'll come over this, I'll go over this later on, but in FHIR standard pages, you will see that they represent information in multiple formats. And here you can actually go to the JSON format. You can click on it and take it to JSON format. So this is how the JSON template for a coding is. And what I mean by complex is that it's not a single value, but instead it's actually an object. So as you can see, this data type is actually an object. So it has several key and value pairs in it, right? So and here's the thing: you cannot define your own keys, right? So you have to use the keys that are given by the standard. That's why they have given you this data type. They have defined the data type for you. It is possible to define your own data types, but that's really complex, and it's way beyond the scope of this discussion. So I'm going to talk about this, but for purposes of the Connectathon, this is all you will need, right? You will need to know that there is somewhere a complex data type that you can look up. You can go to the website, you can click on that, it will give you the structure of it. And this is how to look. And then if you see it, it even tells you what data type, what primitive data type can go in here. So these are primitive data types now. So these are just single values. So here it can tell you for system, you have to put a URI data type, for version, you have to put a string data type, and so on. So that's all there is to it, okay? You have to keep in mind that if it's a complex, it will be an object. If it's simple, then it's just a single value here. That's the difference between simple and complex data types. And a lot of resources, when you go through the resources, you'll see there's a lot of data elements that have these complex data types. So then every time you encounter one, you have to come back to, since all of you are new, even after you've become familiar with it, it's always possible to have to go back and review it. And so you can always click on it and go and check out what exactly it contained. Okay, so I think that's all I had to show you. I'll go back to the slides. So now we know that we are going to represent our data as a JSON object, and we also know what our value would look like. Our value can be a simple primitive data type, or it can be a complex data type, in which case it's an object. So now the next question is, so when you're going to exchange data, how exactly do you exchange it? Like, what do you send across? And the thing is that you have to exchange data in pieces of information that are called resources. And this is the atomic piece of information exchange in FHIR. And you cannot exchange information in any other smaller pieces. Okay, so you cannot decide to send only, I'll just send the string or the number, or maybe even, let's say we saw coding object earlier, right? So if I decide to just send a coding data type across, a coding object across, no, that cannot be done. You have to create a resource a resource is the minimum. And you will see that resource is a collection of many data elements, and each of that data element will be of a data type. So you have to make that collection in order to be able to exchange data. You cannot just send individual values across. And one possible representation, as I said, you can do it in XML, JSON, or Turtle, but we are going to look at JSON. And so one possible representation of a resource is JSON, and it will be a JSON object, as I have mentioned before. So we click on this, and we are going to go to that page where it shows us an example. It actually doesn't show us an example, it shows us a template. So this is what it will look like, right? So it's an object, so there's between curly brackets, and you have some key, and then you have a value. You have a key, and you have a value, key, value, key, value. And again, you can see the value can be a complex type, so it's in curly brackets, right? So it's an object here. And again, here's an object, and then within this object, you have this property, and so on. And here you have actually an array. So this property 4 is now an array, and then within that array is an array of objects, and so on. So the bottom line is this whole thing has to be exchanged. You cannot say, I'm going to just send property 3. No, that won't happen. That's not allowed. You have to create this whole thing. Only then you can exchange data. So the question is, can you decide what these properties are going to be? Like, can you put anything in here, whatever property you want to? And the answer is no. So that's what we are going to talk about next, right? You cannot arbitrarily define what this resource is going to look like. You can invent the data that's in there. It's totally up to you what data you put in, right? What name you put in or what ID you put in. But the structure, what the keys are going to be, those you cannot define. You can define the values, but you cannot define the keys. So all the resource types and their data elements, all the keys are defined by the FHIR specification. You have to use them. And the reason FHIR fixes them is, again, data fidelity, reuse, and performance. Okay, and you'll see what we mean by reuse. Performance means that they try to keep these elements to a minimum, and they try not to create too many data elements in a resource so that it's easy to implement and it's fast to exchange. And here's a list of all the resource types that FHIR has as of now. And remember, since it's not normative yet, it's possible that you can have some resources added or some resources removed, the ones that are not normative yet. So we're going to go look at that list. So this is the page which lists all of them. So there are, I think, like 160 or something total resource types. So what I mean by this is, whenever you're exchanging data, so let's look at the interesting ones, right? So here, patient, practitioner. So if I have to exchange any patient data, I cannot just send the name. I have to create a full patient resource, and then I can exchange it. So like I said, that's the atomic piece of information. You cannot exchange data in smaller pieces than that. So if you go to patient, we'll come to this later, but just to give you an idea, this is the JSON structure for it, okay? So, and in this, you can see there are several keys defined, and you have to use these keys. You cannot call, for example, gender, you cannot call that sex. You have to call it gender, because that's the key that FHIR standard defines. So we'll take a deeper look at the patient resource later, but this is what it looks like, right? So whenever you have to exchange data, you have to send this whole thing. Now, when I say whole thing, actually not everything has to be sent, because not all these elements are required. So some of these are optional. And those of you who are familiar with HL7 V2 are pretty much know what I'm talking about, because same thing we had in V2. If you were sending a PIT segment, not everything in the PIT segment had to be necessarily sent, right? So what goes in which field was defined by the V2 standard, but there were options, right? There were certain fields that are optional, and you did not always have to send them. But when you're sending PIT data, you have to send somebody's name across. You cannot send just the name. You have to send the full PIT segment. So this is very similar. So you have to send the full resource. It doesn't mean you have everything has to be sent. Whatever is available and what's not required doesn't have to be sent. But you still have to create this structure. You still have to create this structure, and you will have to define this field, because this is the one that tells the system that I'm talking about, this is a patient resource. You have to give the patient resource type. That's required. And then a lot of the other things are optional. There might be one or two that are required, but most of them are optional. So we'll take a deeper look at the patient resource later on. But just to give you an idea, this is what I mean when I say a resource. It's basically a JSON object. The keys are defined by FHIR. You have to exchange data as this object. And you have to send data with the same keys. You cannot define your own keys. Of course, the values will come from whatever data you have. So values will change, but the key cannot. Okay. So there's another important thing that we have to talk about, and that is, I've been talking about this reuse and composability, and I've been saying that's an important architectural principle. How is that? How does the FHIR standard ensure that? What do they mean by reuse and composability? So the idea is that, let's say you have patient resources, right? We have created for patient Pack 1, patient 1, patient 2, and patient 3, Pack 1, Pack 2, and Pack 3. Let's say you've created 3 different resources, and you have those resources in your server, let's just say. And let's say these patients come for a visit, right? So now you're going to create encounter resources. So the question, so you create an encounter resource, and now this encounter resource is created for Pack 3, let's just say, all right? Does that mean, now you know that when you have to create a visit, you have to provide a lot of patient information, right? You need things like date of birth, name, patient ID, and so on. So does that mean I have to put everything that again in the encounter resource? And the answer is no. So what FHIR does is it does something called references, and we'll see that in the next slide how it does that. But it basically links from a visit resource to the patient resource. It doesn't repeat all the data that was in patient resource again in the encounter resource. It just links to it. And how that linking happens, we'll see. So let's say now you create another visit or some more visits, and then you have a visit C, and that visit C is actually for patient 2. So you just create a link to patient 2, right? So that's how it's done. And the way it is done is this. So on the patient side, we have all these patient resources created, and they have their IDs. And then on the encounter side too, we have all these resources created, and they have their IDs. And what happens is you create a specific data element. And again, these keys are not something you can define. These keys will come from the FHIR specification. But there will be a key in the encounter resource type that will tell you, or that will allow you to link it to a patient record or to a patient resource. So it will say here, and I know that for encounter it's called subject, I believe. So if you, by defining that subject, you can say this is meant for Pack 3, right? Or this one is meant for Pack 2. So you can say that. So these type of data elements are actually of type reference, and that's what I've listed down here. So it's an element of type reference. So these are called references between resources. Okay, I think we have sufficient information to actually now take a look at a resource. So we are going to now go to patient resource example.
Amrit, there are some questions in the chat if you want to answer.
Okay. Let's see.
Amrit, there are questions on cardinality. I think if you can explain that.
Say again?
So there are some questions, I think, specific to mandatory versus optional fields. So maybe you want to address that. Okay.
Yeah. So how do you know which one are optional? We'll actually look at that when we look at the patient resource. So just hold on to that one. I think we'll talk about that in just a bit. Was there any marking through which we can identify the required objects? Okay, same question. If you look at the structure, they have the cardinality mentioned there for each object. Correct. Oh, I think that was the answer, right? All right.
Yeah.
So So let's take a look at patient source, and I think things will become clear as we go through this. So when you look at when you go to this page, this is for specifically for patient type of resource. And if you go to this page, you will see there's as I mentioned earlier, in FHIR they give the information in multiple formats, and the one that is most informative, and it comes from something called structure definition, which is again beyond the scope of this talk. But there's a structure that's the structure of your resource, and that is given here in the under structure tab, and that's the one you probably want to look at first. All right. So here, what you see is I have the resource called patient, right? That's my patient. That's my resource type. And in that, I have all these different possible data elements. So as Aditi had mentioned in the chat, you will see there is a column called cardinality. And it says over here, minimum and maximum number of times the element can appear in the instance. So what does that mean? That means if the minimum number here is 1, that means that you have to have that element. You cannot ignore it, right? So here's one. Well, this one is actually, okay. So they don't quite have one here. So they have one here. Okay, let's talk about cardinality a bit more before we look at that. So that's one thing. The other thing is they have these stars. These stars mean that you can, this is similar to repeatable field in V2. So it means you can repeat this element again and again. So you can have it multiple times, right? So which means it's an array. It's an array when you represent it in JSON format, it's an array because it can have the same structure repeating again and again. Here's your data type that we talked about earlier, all right? So, and then here's a description of your data element, all right? So let's come back to cardinality. So in cardinality, if it starts with 0, that means it's optional, right? If it starts with 1, it means it's required. If you see the ending, the maximum cardinality is star, that means it's it goes up to infinite. You can have as many as you want. So it's a repeatable field. Now, if you go down, so most of them you are seeing, you can have one time like marital status and name. So now if you go to this one, right, communication. So communication, you will see, is like an object. So whenever it says backbone element, it means it's an object. And this is similar to saying it's a complex data type, right? But it doesn't have a data type. That's why they don't give a data type here. But if you see here, it has 2 subparts to it. It has 2 elements in it. There's language and there's preferred. So the idea here is communication itself is repeatable, but it's optional, right? You can repeat it multiple times, but you may not have it at all. However, the point here is if you do have it, then you have to have language inside it. So what this means is if you do have a communication key in your JSON object, then you have to have language within it, and you have to have a value for language because minimum cardinality is 1. So this is one example where cardinality is required, but it's required within the scope of this object. Now, you can have cases where cardinality is an absolute must. And I mean, some elements are an absolute must. And let me see if I can find one. Okay, so here's one example, right? So this is allergy intolerance resource. This is where you basically record the allergies. Now, when you're recording an allergy, you have to say who this allergy is for, right? You cannot define who this allergy is meant for, right? You have to say which patient this is for. And we talked about references earlier in the slides. So this is where you will see, instead of repeating the whole patient information here, what it does is it links to the patient. So there's a field here called patient, which is a reference type. I mentioned this earlier. The data type is reference. and it's a data type of reference that links to a patient resource. And here you see its cardinality goes from 1 to 1, which means that this allergy, obviously one allergy cannot be, so when we create these resources, we create one allergy resource per allergy per patient. So obviously this allergy resource cannot be for 2 patients. So that's why you see maximum is 1. But you also have to have the patient. You cannot just have an allergy resource and not say who it was meant for, right? Because that makes no sense. So that's why you see that minimum cardinality here is 1. So in this case, this is different from what you saw on the patient resource, but because this is an element that is required in your resource. So you have to have that, that element. In the case of patient, it was slightly different because that language was a requirement only if you were putting a communication object. Okay, so I think that's, does that answer the question? I think it should. And then, so you're looking at cardinality, you're looking for minimum cardinality of 1. That means it's a required field. The other thing is, let's look at the JSON structure of this, since we're going to talk about JSON. So here's my curly bracket. That's a starting. You see the key. And this is interesting because you don't actually see a key defined for that here, because that you have to provide, right? That I earlier mentioned, you have to provide that it's a required element resource type. Without that, there's no meaning, like what is your resource for? So you have to provide that. And then beyond that, everything is just exactly like you see here. You have identifier, active, name, telecom, all these are listed down here. And then here you can see, because name is a repeatable field, so if you go back here, name was repeating, right? So it was an array. That's why you see an array here, right? And why do you see an array of object? You see an array of object because if you go at this data type is a complex type. So you can repeat it, but it's a complex type. It has so many parts inside it. So you'll have to basically build this object. And once again, in this object, not everything has to be mentioned. As you can see, everything is essentially optional here. So nothing is required. So whatever you want, if you only have, for example, the family name, that's all you put, right? Okay. So that's what you're looking at here. All right, so I think that's basically the idea. So you can see the JSON, the JSON skeleton here. Now, if you want to see examples, if you go to the top of the page of any resource page, right now I was looking at the content here, and in this content, then I had further tabs down here: structure, UML, XML, JSON, turtle. You can see all those. This means difference against R3 version, so this is not important. This is like the older version of FHIR, so they are saying what changed against the older version. But if you go to the top, there's also tabs here, and there's an example tab. If you go to the example tab, you will see examples. And I'm going to pull one example. Let's just take the first one. And then again, they've given it in 3 different formats. So we're going to look at JSON. Okay. So here's the example. And again, it's a resource. This is the minimum you will have to exchange when you exchange data. You'll have to exchange this whole object. Again, not everything has to be entered there, but you'll have to create this object. And in that object, you'll have to have resource type required, all right? Everything below this depends on the definition. In the definition, again, you'll have to go back to the content, right? So you'll have to go back to content. In that content, you can see what the cardinality is. And that will tell you if it's required or not. So, so a lot of these you will see are not actually required. Actually, none of them in patient are required. So other than this resource type. So here's an ID. This is the ID of this resource. So we'll talk a little bit about this in a minute. But also, other interesting thing is they'll see a element called text. And this is the narrative. And you will see this many times. You will see this in the resource. And this is essentially meant to be human readable, or more actually meant to be is possible. So it's as you see, it's written in that HTML format, so that you can basically, this can be published directly on a website and you can actually read it in human readable form. So it essentially carries the information that is inside the resource in a human readable format. So this narrative field is, according to FHIR, is the minimum you should have in a resource, because minimum not a requirement, but as in there is no value to your resource if you don't provide this, because you have to also provide the human readable part to it. And you can have a resource without any of the machine readable part below, which is the JSON individual keys. You can just have this narrative alone, and that's still valid. So that's all I had to say about that one. It's not going to be important for our work, but it's important to know, because if you come across resources examples, you'll see that often there. And then there are other fields like we already saw. So let's talk about ID. Now you see ID here, and then you see identifier here. So what's going on there? Why do we have it 2 times? So the thing is, this ID is actually the ID of the resource. So it's a technical ID. It's an ID that's provided, let's say, by a server. Most of the time, this ID will be assigned by a server, because the server is going to, it's like, for example, if you're working with Google server, you will see it's going to assign like a hexadecimal number there. It's a huge hexadecimal string that will provide you as the ID. So it's very, it's server dependent. Most of the time, server is going to assign that. The identifier is actually the business identifier. That's the one where you're going to provide MRN, or your enterprise ID, or your, I don't know, hospital ID, right? If you have multiple hospitals within your organization, you have a different ID for that hospital, patient ID in that hospital, so it's a hospital MRN. So all those would go in the identifier. Or say social, let's say your Aadhaar number, right? That's your identifier, or your driver license number. So all those are identifiers, and they go in this field. So keep that in mind, that don't get confused with these two. ID is assigned by the server, usually not something you will necessarily work with. And most of the times you are going to work with this field, because this is the business identifier. And you will see both these fields in pretty much every resource. And the rest of it is just like we discussed. It's a JSON format. And here you see identifier. You can have multiple identifiers. Like I said, you can have driver's license, you can have Aadhaar number, you can have the hospital MRN, and so on. So it's a repeatable field. So you can see it's an array. It's an array of object, because the identifier data type is complex data type. So it's an array of object. So you can see it's an array, and then you have an object, and it actually, this object ends here. So this object ends here. So actually they have only given one identifier, but it's possible to give more than one. So all this you're seeing is actually one identifier. So it's all, this is the complex data type. So all this is it's not necessarily needed, but this is basically the full structure. So here if you see, and then again, to know exactly what this data type is, you will have to go to the data type and see what all these keys mean, right? So it's not something you can learn by heart. It's just something you'll have to keep on referencing here to check out, right? So if you go to identifier, it gives you the data type. Very conveniently, you can click on it and it takes you right there. So it takes you to the identifier, and then it tells you this, my identifier carries all these things. And in this also, you will see some of these are complex. So this is a simple, this is simple, this is simple, but these guys are complex. And you can actually, if you are paying attention, you will notice that the icon is different, right? So for a simple one, it's like a rectangle. For complex one, it's a box, because you can open the box and you can find more envelopes inside that. So here, these are simple one envelopes. These are like, this is a box, and it's going to carry more envelopes inside. So you can click on this, and then there's more stuff inside it. And then this one is again a box. We click on it, and there's, so that's why when we were looking at the patient example there, you were seeing all that. So you were seeing so many, you see, you have so many objects inside, because these are all boxes. So this was a box, this is a box here, then there's another box here. So these are all objects. Okay. So now what if you needed something that's not here? What if FHIR gave you all these data types, right? So let's go back to that patient content. And you had all these data types in here. Not data types, I mean the data elements in here. And each element has a data type. What if, so if you see there's a birth date here, right? There's a birth date. But what if I wanted to construct a horoscope, and I also wanted the time, right? I don't have that here. It's not giving me the time. It's just giving me the birth date. So I need to, so if I, for my particular use case, I need a birth time as well. So what do I do? So FHIR tries to control anything extra you want to add. There is a way you can add stuff. Okay, it's very strongly controlled and strictly controlled in FHIR. There's a, when I say control, I mean you have to do it in a specific manner. You cannot just add anything you want. You cannot give your own key and just add it. You have to do it in a very specific way. And in this example, right, they have done that. So here's this. So I wanted a birth date. I have a birth date, but I don't have a birth time. So what you do is you create something called an extension, and in that extension you can actually provide a time now. You see it's given a birth date and then it has a time too. So you'll have to, and there's a specific way, again, we are not going to talk about it, but I just wanted to let you know, because if in the mappings we happen to see something like this, and there are some mappings where they have, because they couldn't find an element in FHIR, like something like race, for example. Patient race is something that the FHIR standard doesn't, the core standard doesn't have. But in US, race is a very important, it's a required field. They need race in pretty much everything. Every time they have a patient registered, they need that information. So that is not a part of the standard FHIR elements, because in Europe, actually, race is illegal. You cannot report that on the patient record. So there are two opposite requirements. So that's why what FHIR has done, they've given the common minimum. And then if you want to add race, or if you wanted to add birth time, you will have to do an extension. So you will see this in the mappings, because I know that they did mapping for race, seen the ADT one. So you might come across these extensions. So I think that's all I want to say about it, because it's really very complex procedure and there's a lot of stuff that needs to be done, which we're not going to talk about. But you should just know that it is possible to add extra elements. And if you do that, you have to do that in a very specific way. There's a defined mechanism for that. And all of them are called extensions. So there's this extension key used for that. So that's an important point. There's one last thing I think I want to talk about today. And that is, sometimes you will see things like this. So you will see something like this. It says question mark, deceased. And what it is saying is, FHIR standard is not 100% sure which data type you want to send this information in, right? So for all these, the data type is defined. It's very fixed. You can't change it. And that goes back to data fidelity, right? You don't want the users to put in whatever they want there. They have to follow that specific data format. Here, however, there is option. So this is basically saying there's an option. And that's why there's a question mark. So it's saying you can either use this one or this one. And depending on your use case, supposing the way you are defining deceased, somebody's death, is you're just saying, yes, they are dead, or no, they are alive, right? So you just put it true or false. So that's the Boolean way of saying that. Or the other option is you just give the date and time. So you basically define exactly when the patient died. And that means obviously the patient died. So you don't need to then say true or false, because if the date and time is there, that means the patient has died. And if there's no date and time, that means the patient is alive. So that's how, so there's an option. You can go this way or you can go that way. So that's what this type of structure means. You will see that sometimes. Okay, I think that's, and then references we've already seen. There are some references here too. There's a reference, for example, to general practitioner. So, it's a reference to a practitioner resource. So that is basically who's your GP. right? So that's what you define here. So instead of putting all the GP information in the patient record, you just give a reference. And then if you want information about the GP, you just go to that record and figure it out there. So that's it. Any questions about what we have discussed? Let's see if there are any questions on the. So Aditi answered some of them. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, so for insurance, they have a coverage resource. So it's totally different, like Praveen mentioned there. So one of the things I think you guys should do now that you are, at least you know what you're looking at, and I will post these links to the pages, the important pages that I went through on the from the specification. One of the things I think you should do is, if you go to the resources, so this is the list of resources, and at least you can kind of look through them. I will tell you to ignore foundation. Okay, this is detailed stuff. This is complicated stuff beyond the scope here. So if you skip foundation, but from base onwards, these will begin to make sense to you. So there's patient type, there's a practitioner type, and as I mentioned earlier, these are defined by FHIR standard. You cannot create your own resource type. Not possible. You have to use one of these. So all the financial stuff goes in this section here, and you can see there's coverage, there's claim response, payment, etc. So everything is there. Same way, if you want anything related to administration, you will find it in this layer, the base layer. Patient, practitioner, organization, devices, locations, groups, everything is in this one. If you want anything clinical, it's in this section. So you will see reports, observations, you will find things like procedure, problems, and medication, statement, medication administration, everything. So everything clinical is in this layer. So these are called layers. So you have a foundation layer, base layer, clinical layer, and then you have a financial layer, and finally you have a specialized layer. So the one I think you should completely ignore is foundation and specialized for now. And if you've already worked in healthcare and worked with V2, the ones that are listed in base through financial should make sense to you. So I think this is a good point. And then if you want to get a feel of like what these look like, you can click on them, and that will, for example, let's see if I want to look at what the provider record looks like, right? So go to practitioner. Again, the same thing. You have what this contains. Contains the identifier, right? Whether this doctor is active or maybe he's retired or whatever. So that's whatever this is saying, and their name and telecom and so on. So you can see all these fields here. You can see examples. You can go to the top. You can click on examples. You can see some examples. This practitioner resource. And okay. So then you can also see, look at, you can look at, so there's a diagnostic report, right? That's your like lab report. So that's, go there and then you can see the details here, right? And what you will see here, it talks about which encounter this is for and so on. It will talk about which patient it is for, it's the subject. And then you will see it will also have a reference to something called observation. It's a resource, and that's where you actually put the result. So this doesn't really carry result, it's more like the metadata. The result you have to actually put here. So you have to go to observation, and then you have to create an observation resource and link to that observation resource from diagnostic report. So this is a very good example of how you use references, and one that is very often used. And we will definitely be looking at this one during our session, because we will be doing ORU and ORF messages. So we'll be going to diagnostic report and observations quite a bit. Okay. Is there any question that has not been answered in the chat? It's a long list, so I'll just ask the question.
I think there was a question on maturity level, if you could explain them.
Okay. So maturity level is, like I mentioned, the FHIR
the link is in the chat.
Okay. Versions. Yeah, actually it's versions. Okay. Right. So maturity level. So let's just yeah. So they're given here. So actually, so what FHIR, like we said, what FHIR does. Actually, this is better here. So it's a developing standard. So what they do is they this was initially, the idea was proposed by a person called Graham Grieve. He's an Australian, and he was the one who actually proposed the idea of this standard, how the data should be shared, what the structure and so on, and the referencing. Referencing is actually like the key, the heart of this whole concept. So the draft is basically, initially when he started creating these resources, right, they were really, nobody had used them, they were just being created. So that's what the draft would be, right? It's just like, I have an idea, I think I need this information, I'm going to propose these data elements and this structure, and that's my draft. Then what happens is, once the draft is created, they put it out, okay, and actually you can right now see things that are in draft mode there, some of the things. So once it's been created, it is put out on the FHIR website, and then people start using them, and then people start implementing them. And as people implement them, they test them. They are also tested in Connectathon. That's the probably the biggest use of Connectathon. That's what Connectathon is really meant for, is to test anything that FHIR develops, anything that HL7 develops as a part of FHIR. They want people to test it out, and they want to test them out with the real, like real scenarios, right? The scenarios that are actually seen in the actual real business cases. So they want people to do that, and that's Connectathons are basically a big step towards that. A lot of the resources content becomes normative after it has been validated, tested, and validated. So after testing, they do a step of balloting where they basically vote and say, okay, whatever right now they have, that is what we want, right? People have tested it, it works for people, so we are going to vote for it or vote against it. So people whoever is authorized to vote for it votes for it, and then based on whatever majority says, they will either change it or they will go with that. So once it has been validated and once it has been implemented further across the world, then they make it normative. So that's the process. So the normative is when it's now not going to change. There won't be any breaking changes. But until it gets to normative, it can change. And it goes through these multiple steps, right? So it has, based on these multiple steps, it has these maturity levels. So 0 is draft, is just being created. And then, maybe FMM1 is like when people have started using it. And you can see the particular details here. And then so on. So basically, as you go from draft, you go higher and higher, means the content is becoming more and more tested and refined. That's what it means. So the higher you see the maturity level, it means the content is more refined. And once it reaches 5, that's when it becomes normative. So that means now it has achieved that level of 5. So it is now normative, no more breaking changes. So whatever has been given there on the website is going to stay there. Things can be added, but nothing will, whatever is there will be broken. That's what it says. So that's what these maturity models are basically in summary. And then there are details which you can read through here. But the idea is, if you're seeing a higher maturity level resource, it means that that resource is not going to change, is less likely to change something that is at a lower level, because a lower level means it's still in the very initial phases of testing. So there's a big chance for change. Okay, I think that's it. I think we are out of time also. So what we are going to do is we are going to end today's session. But what I'm going to recommend, especially to people who are beginners, is really go through these links, go to the website, look at resources, look at the resource list. And if you click on the resources on top, that gives you the resource list. Look at this list, familiarize yourself with what kind of resources we have, especially clinical and administrative, because a lot of what we will do will involve these guys here. And then also in anything that is of interest to you, you can click on it and go to the detailed description. You can look at the JSON structure, the skeleton, and you can also look at a full-fledged example by going into examples and clicking on any of the examples available. If you are interested in XML, you can also look at XML, but we'll be working with JSON. So there's a JSON. You can find a JSON structure for all the examples there. Okay. So I think that's it. So I'll just summarize this. So we talked about FHIR architecture. We talked about what the architectural principles were, and we talked about the components, and that is basically the foundation of FHIR. We talked about the JSON exchange format. We talked about FHIR data types, the FHIR resources. Then we talked about references. We looked at the patient resource example. We talked about the various elements, that is how it's described in different ways: structure, UML, XML, JSON, and so on. We briefly talked about ID versus identifier. Remember, ID is system defined, it's server defined. Identifier is your business identifier. That's where you put all the MRNs and your order number and so on. We talked about narrative, and we talked about extensions. That is a very controlled way of how you can add any element that you want. And then besides this, we also talked about things like cardinality. How do you tell whether it's a required field or not? And also about data types, right? Like how you tell which data type each element is. So again, I'll recommend you go through the website. Next time we come back on Friday, we're going to talk about how do we exchange this data that we talked about today. So how do we exchange resources? Remember, resources are the most atomic piece of information. You cannot exchange data in any smaller pieces. But how are we going to exchange resources between systems is something is also defined, like I said, by FHIR. FHIR specifies exactly how you have to do that. And we'll talk about that. And then we'll also talk about something called bundled resource type next time, because it's very important whenever we do, whenever we exchange data, the data is usually exchanged in bundles. So we'll talk about that next time also. Okay, so I think this was recorded. So I'm going to also share this presentation in case you want to go over anything we talked about again.